Welcome to this side event. I hope you all you were able to find the secret cache of sandwiches that was just sort of beyond this room. If you have not, you're welcome to go and quickly grab one, although I understand that they'd rather you not eat them in this room, so maybe sort of tuck it away. This event is designed to raise a question that we have been looking at now for a short time at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. We're very fortunate today to have some very expert speakers to help us to set up what I hope will be a discussion among all of us about the issues. We have neither the intention nor the ability to give a full answer to the question of our title. And so we hope that we will all work together to try to respond to it. Before I would like to give just a few words about the papers that you have found in front of you. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce our panel of distinguished speakers. I have to my right Priscilla Duque, who is the Assistant Civil Defense Executive Officer in the Office of Civil Defense in the Philippines. She's also the Chief of the Training Division there. And she was instrumental in the development and now the rolling out of the Philippines' now quite famous new legislation on disaster risk management. And so she'll be speaking to us about where that came from and why they undertook that particular road. On my far right here, I have architect Gustavo Lara, who is the Director General of the Dominican Republic Red Cross. And he is also a member of the National Emergency Commission and on the National Council on the Prevention, Mitigation, and Response to Disasters in the Dominican Republic. The National Society in the Dominican Republic is one of our very strong members working on the issue of risk reduction, particularly at the community level. And they are also work very closely with their authorities, including in the development and now the actual implementation of the legislation in the Dominican Republic adopted in 2002, which was very progressive on the issue of risk reduction. And so he'll be speaking a bit about that. On my left, my far left, we have Mette Lindahl Olsen, who is the head of the Natural Hazards and Critical Infrastructure section at the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. She's also been a major player in this, Sweden's national platform on risk reduction. And as I understand it, the MSB was also an important founding member of the regional, European regional platform on disaster risk reduction, which Mette chaired last year. They also, at the national level, undertook a very interesting review of Sweden's own laws relevant to risk reduction, and she'll be touching on that during her presentation. She gave me a quick glance of it. It being in Swedish, I can only say that it must be great. And finally, close to me here on the left, I have Mary Picard, who is an international law expert and was most recently involved in the development of the new humanitarian charter for the Sphere project that many of you may be familiar with. She's been involved with our program at the Federation, a number of past projects, including work that we've done in Guatemala, and most recently on a study about risk reduction in law in Nepal. And so she'll be giving you an overview of that study. Our intention is for the speakers to give us just a fairly brief presentations. I'm going to be rather strict with the time to make sure that we have some time for discussion. This room is a bit difficult. We're very distant from each other physically, but I hope that we can try to bring our ideas closer together if we have enough time. Before I turn over to wiser speakers, I just note that you've probably found, most of you, a few documents at your seat. a small desk review that we did in our participation with the UN ISDR for the Global Assessment Review, looking at legislative trends on risk reduction and how countries, particularly since the Hyogo framework, have been addressing this in their laws. We've recently also been sponsoring a couple of particular case studies, which is work that's ongoing. And we have a couple of summaries that you see in front of you that I think may be informative for our discussion. In the Red Cross and Red Crescent, as many of you know, our members gather their main strength from volunteers. They work at the community level. And we also have a very important international network through the Federation, whose secretariat I work for. And this has given them quite an important perspective from what they say the front line of doing risk reduction work, particularly with communities directly. And it's partly from this and partly from the work that we have been doing in the Federation legally on international disaster response laws that we've derived this interest in looking at how can legislation really promote risk reduction at the community level. What we hear from our members and from a lot of experts in the field is that there's a lot of countries have now integrated language and provisions about risk reduction into their national laws. But when you get to the community level, those good intentions sometimes start becoming sparse on the ground in terms of action. There are good practices out there that can be gathered up. And these are the kinds of things that we'd like to put together. We also are very conscious, though, that the area of risk reduction is very broad. And there's, unlike some areas of law, it's very policy-based. So there's not one, certainly not one sort of legal science answer to the question of exactly how you can make the right law for community-level work. But it must be the case that we can learn from the experience of different countries and try to put them to work for communities. We find in the review that we have done so far that there's not much guidance out there at the international level. Every major document from the Hyogo framework to the various manuals that have been given to states and community actors emphasize the importance of legislation, but then they don't go on to say what should be in the legislation. And so we're looking to see if there's some substance there, and we're hoping that this discussion will help inform that. So with that long introduction, and thanking you for your patience, I'm going to turn over the floor to Priscilla to talk about the Philippine experience.
Thank you, David. Thanks for inviting the Philippines to share with the group how we did it in terms of disaster risk reduction legislation. Because as David has mentioned, we just our Congress, the Congress of the Philippines, has just enacted a pioneering law, which is called the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. So just last year, and this is now the law that governs the disaster risk reduction management system in the Philippines. And so just to share with you how we did it in terms of developing this disaster law, sharing the Philippine experience in these regards. Of course, it was a very long struggle to have this law passed by the Congress of the Philippines. You have one? Okay. And so just to bring you to the Philippines, you've heard, I think you've heard a lot about it in terms of the disaster occurrences. It's an island country in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, that's the Philippines. And so it's a 7,107 island country, but during high tide, it's only 7,100 islands. The 7 islands disappear. And so virtually this is the scope of my presentation, a background on the making of Republic Act 10121 dated May 27, 2010, the building blocks for the enactment of this law, how we did it in terms of the approaches, the strategies, and then the challenges of implementing the new law. So it was indeed a long process, a 21 year in the making. It passed through 7 Congresses, 4 administration, and finally it was signed into law on May 27, 2010, and there is now the implementing rules and regulations signed by the chairperson of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council last September 17, 2010. So this is the title of RA 10121, Strengthening the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management System, providing for the DRRM framework, institutionalization of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, and appropriating funds and for other purposes. And so this law provides for the development of policies, plans, and implementation of actions and measures pertaining to all aspects of disaster risk reduction and management, from mitigation, prevention, preparedness, response, and on to recovery and rehabilitation, including governance at various levels, national and local, risk assessments and early warning, knowledge building and awareness raising, reducing underlying risk factors, and of course, a very important component to preparing for effective response and early recovery. The building blocks of our successful legislative reform. Of course, the presence of relevant policy environment in disaster management since the 70s, 1978, of course, the Hyogo framework for action, the institutionalization of the cluster approach as introduced to us by the United Nations, and then at the regional level, the forging of an ASEAN agreement on disaster management and emergency response. And then, of course, in 2010, RA 10121 was passed by Congress. And then, of course, the policy environment at the international level through the Hyogo framework for action, priorities for action. The 5 priorities are heavily integrated in RA 10121. You're familiar with it. And of course, at the regional level, the ADMIR, or the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response. This is now ratified by all 10 countries of the ASEAN, of Southeast Asia, and the first ever HFA-related binding instrument in the world, the ADMIR. And then the planning instruments at the national level, our National Calamities and Disaster Preparedness Plan, of course, the contingency plans of the various agencies of local government units, the NDCC 4-point action plan on disaster preparedness, and the SNAP on disaster risk reduction, the Strategic National Action Plan on DRR as called for under the Hyogo framework for action as one of the drivers for the passage of this law. This is the latest National Action Plan on DRR. There are 5 strategic objectives like the enabling environment, financial and economic soundness, supportive decision-making, safety and well-being, enhancement and implementation and evaluation of disaster risk reduction. There are 18 priority programs and projects under the Strategic National Action Plan on DRR, as shown. Of course, while it's bad for us to be thankful to 3 successive typhoons that hit the country in 2001, but somehow they facilitated really the enactment of Republic Act 10121. I'm referring to the TOPS, Typhoons Ondoy, Pepeng, and Santi. And so Pepeng came, Ondoy came, Santi came, and that perhaps made our Congress move faster, and so they enacted the much-awaited law on disaster risk reduction and management. And so other building blocks like the clear leadership and common vision of DRR as more of a development issue rather than just a humanitarian assistance issue. Of course, the geographical location of the Philippines makes us very vulnerable to almost all types of natural hazards. So whether we like it or not, we really have to do something to mitigate, to prevent the occurrence of disasters in our country. and of course the growing complexity and intensity of disasters, other building blocks, the engagement of the other stakeholders in the drafting of this new law, Red Cross, line ministries, local government units, the private sector, people's organization, non-government organization. One building block that really facilitated the passage of this new law is the active participation of the chairman of the Philippine Red Cross and even the champion of DRR in the Asia Pacific in the persons of Senator Gordon and Senator Loren Ligarda. And of course, there is a very active DRR national platform in the Philippines who really advocated for the passage of RA 10121. So consultations with the various sectors was one of the approaches engaging selected members of Congress at both houses, upper and lower houses. It would be good for you to know that there was a tandem, a father and son tandem at the lower house of Congress and upper house of Congress, who were the sponsors of the law. Senator Biason at the upper house in the Senate, and Congressman Biason, his son, at the lower house of Congress. I don't know if you will be able to find a partnership of this, our father and son partnership in your respective Congress to push for a DRRM law in your respective countries. So focus group discussions were also used on some thematic areas like policies, institutional arrangements, training, and education, some of those thematic areas. The impact of RA 10121 on the promotion of DRR at the community level. If you are going to read RA 10121, most of the provisions there are for the local government units. So really the law provided the impetus to pursue DRR initiatives, especially at the local government level, the enhanced DRR mandate for local government units, institutionalized community participation. There is now a clarity of roles as well as functions of the various disaster risk reduction and management councils from the national, regional, down to the local level. There's a defined resource funding allocation because one of the very good provisions of the law is the determination of specific funding source. 5% of the estimated revenue from all sources at the local government level should be allocated as disaster risk reduction and management fund. And of course, the law further empowered the community insofar as DRRM is concerned. Our major challenges now is walking the talk in terms of the implementation of the law, the policies initiated therein, the mobilization of the resources, and of course sustaining the achievements of DRR in various sectors, the monitoring and evaluation of the performances of the standards in DRR as among the challenges, addressing the other perceived operational gaps, like the victims' rights, protection of volunteers from liability, the SOPs, the SASOPs, guiding principles, and even continuity of operations planning, business continuity planning is one big challenge also for us. And of course, how are we going to harmonize the implementation of the DRRM law, of the climate change adaptation law, and other related sectoral laws on DRRM for effective governance as among the major challenges in the Philippines. So maraming salamat, thank you, and you can access a copy of RA 10121 at this website, www.ndcc.gov.ph. Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Priscilla. Yes, it's fine just to pass that on. It's a very, very comprehensive and I think very interesting sort of approach both to where community-sensitive disaster risk reduction law can come from, and it obviously doesn't happen overnight, even in a very motivated community like in the Philippines. But there are some important innovations that are already in the law, And just one sort of note from the Geneva side, we've definitely noticed when we do just, if you start doing Google searches for disaster and legislation, it used to be that you get only disaster declarations from various states of the United States. And now it's almost all from the Philippines. So quite a lot of discussion is coming, and a lot of it is coming from as a result of this law. With that, now we'll pass the floor over to Gustavo.
If we look to the framework, legal framework, we have the Constitution. The Constitution establish the right of the people and the right to be protected. The National Strategy Development Plan establish also the principles and have some strategic edges, always talking about risk reduction from disasters, and we have the main law of the country. Most of you have the copy of the law. Please show. Most of you have a copy. This is the main law of the country about the risk management, and it also is proactive law. He established principles, politics, mechanisms, instruments, everything talking about risk reduction and protection of people. We talk about a lot of other laws, environmental law, local governments, Minister of Economy and Planification. We have public inversion, decentralization, funds transfer from local governments, the budgeting, climate change, the water, provision. We have all those, a lot of laws, a lot of principles, all of them referring to risk reduction and centralizing in the protection of people, of the community. Even the main law, our main law have its principles are protection, prevention, competence, coordination, participation, and decentralization. That's the way our law started. His politics established as a main objective prevent or reduce the loss of lives or goods. We also established in the law the instrument, the tools. How can we achieve that? We have the national system. We have the National Plan of Risk Management, the National Emergency Plan. You have the proposed national system for integrated communication, and you have the national funding for prevention, mitigation, and response. But even we have in the structure of the law, we have at national level the National Council and the National Commission, two bodies. One is led by the President of the Republic and the second is led by the President of the National Commission. In the middle level, we have the Regional Commission for Prevention, Mitigation and Response and the provinces committees. And in the bottom, we have in each one of the cities one municipal committee, as a committee for prevention, mitigation and response. We also have experience that at that level, most of us talk about local when we talk about the municipality, most of us. But in the other experience, that's not local, that's municipal, that is second level of local. There we have no people, that organization. The people are behind that. The people are in the neighborhoods where people are suffering to be affected by the floods, by the earthquake, by the storm. So, in that, this community of risk, this is the organization that we got in this local, this municipal level. You got all organizations participating. But we're not talking about, again, about the ideal country. This map reflects the poverty where live the hardest color is where a lot more, maybe 100 or 1,000 people live on poverty. This is the scheme of the country. But what are we doing in the whole world? That's my experience looking. Even we talk about, we have the laws, we have the principles, we talk about the people, protecting the people, risk reduction. We invest our resources in the head, in the national teams, some of other small amount at the city level, and a very tiny amount at the community level, where you have a lot of people suffering, a lot of people dying, and a lot of people who doesn't know how to do. And we look at it everywhere. Our experience in the communities we have been working is that if we invest the highest amount of resources at the community level, that means in the boroughs, in the places where people vulnerable is living, building a community, we call that redes comunitarias, and then we reinforce the capacity at the city level and guarantee also the quality of the national teams, we will have a better solution in the country. There, when we do that, people don't die. Even we are affected by the problems, people don't die. People are able to be part of the solution. People with the knowledge, with the experience, be part of the solution. And we have to do a lot of work. Even we have that, we have to keep working in the proactivity. We can guarantee proactivity. We have not to wait for the next storm to work. We have to empower the community. We have to keep mobilizing resources for the community level. You have to promote the activities. You have to guarantee the mechanism for achieving those objectives. You have to contribute to guarantee the roles of the actors. We have to also be with the national authorities, or with the politicians, to make influence, to make advocacy with them. And we have to do everywhere. We are not going to achieve that objective just talking here. We are not going to achieve those objectives just being in our organization. We have to be in the community like this. We have to be talking with the stakeholders, international stakeholders, national stakeholders. We have to work investing in the women, to participate actively at the local level, this ground level. We have to talk with the local authorities to guarantee. We have to be sharing the information with the national intervention teams to have everything examples, how can we do it. If we do that, we will guarantee the participation of the community and we will achieve the goal. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Gustavo. It's a very wide breadth of that you covered there in terms of ground. And you made an important point that can sometimes be forgotten when you start thinking about the disaster law. That is obviously not just one law. Certainly not the case in the Philippines, not the case in the Dominican Republic. There's a whole collection of laws that need to be effective in order to have good disaster risk management, and that they need to be sensitive to work at the community level. Both the Dominican Republic's law and the Philippines law have an important role of setting out not only coordination mechanisms, but also the principles that guide the entire system. And yet, despite this positive approach that is really very much focused on risk reduction, we've heard that there's still a sort of inverse triangle of investment happening in the with that, I'd like to give the floor to Menta.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar about legislation. We're very proud that the Swedish National Platform and the Civil Contingencies Agency has the pleasure to be part of this. And you have already introduced me, so I'll press this button. It's very essential that relevant elements of disaster risk reduction become an integral part of climate adaptation and land use planning. And as already been said, there is a whole set of legislation that has to come together to fully be integrated to have a good mandate and resources to handle disaster risk reduction. The primary natural disasters we are handling in Sweden are flooding, winter storms, forest fires, and landslides. And what you see here at the left is a picture that shows rivers covered by general flood inundation maps that level so that they can work further on their risks. On the right picture, it shows our forest fire prognosis system, fire weather index, and it indicates the conditions due to the risk and spread of grass and forest fires. And in the red part, in the lower part there, some municipalities at this point, and they can do so due to the legislation to prevent fires from occurring. And that's a strong mandate they have at the municipal level. But Sweden, that is situated in Northern Europe, bordering Finland and Norway, we have 9 million inhabitants, and we have 290 municipalities, each led by a municipal executive board, appointed by an elected municipal council. And also municipalities is entitled to levy income taxes and provide a wide range of essential services for its inhabitants. Decisions made by the government and the parliament are implemented by the ministers through the governmental agencies. And the governmental agencies are each linked to a ministry but works independently, implementing laws and taking decisions with their own areas of responsibility. And civil protection or disaster risk reduction is defined as public safety in the form of protection from incidents, accidents, and other types of emergencies and disasters. And the Swedish emergency preparedness system aims to protect life and health, critical infrastructure, and fundamental values from the consequences from all types of disaster. And we use a comprehensive risk-based emergency preparedness program, including both prevention, planning, preparedness, response, and recovery. And the Swedish preparedness system is primarily built on 3 fundamental principles. Firstly, the responsibility. And that means that whoever is responsible for an activity during normal conditions should maintain a corresponding responsibility, as well as initiating cross-sector cooperation, also during emergencies. And this is very important at all levels. The secondly fundamental principle is equality. All are equal in before the law and should be equally treated in similar cases. The third fundamental principle is the proximity. accidents and disasters are to be managed by resources as close to the event as possible. The Swedish legislation, the municipalities, the responsibility to be the first liners. They are also responsible not only for responding to catastrophes, but also for working with other phases of disaster management, prevention, preparedness, recovery, and lessons learned. And we used to say that we have a bottom-up approach in Sweden, building on the responsibility of the municipalities. Swedish municipalities have a large degree of autonomy and play an important role in civil emergency planning, preparedness and response, as well as preventing accidents and disasters through land use. Fundamental requirement in the Planning and Building Act is that land has to be suitable for building development. And we have a strong set of legislation in place when preventing, and also who has the responsibility in the event of a disaster. Are, in accordance with the Civil Protection Act, managed by the municipal rescue services, while decisions during major emergencies are made by the municipal executive board, which is the highest civilian authority within the municipality. They are responsible for all civilian command and crisis management at local level. But, to be honest, it's all about money. Even Swedish municipalities struggle with their budgets and can only afford what is legally binding or highly prioritized. That is why we need basic national legislation to promote disaster risk reduction. And the area of land use planning, civil protection and civil emergency preparedness is rather strongly regulated in Sweden, while actions to be taken to adapt to changing climate this far is triggered by subsidies, research, knowledge exchange and support from national level. Legislation must build on the national situation and be combined with guidelines, information, networking, lessons learned, research, and the strongest measure is to give governmental subsidies or to march to prove the cost effectiveness by actions to put focus on the right area. What we see needed for the moment is strengthening of activities related to vital societal functions at all levels, and these activities should be complemented and also including the private sector as well as the public people. And municipalities need supporting legislation and mandate and resources to put weight, political commitment and money on the right things. Legislation is important, but it does not guarantee safety. It is vital to build on local capacities and knowledge, because almost all accidents and disasters occur at a geographic pace and must be prevented, prepared for, and responded at local level. And municipalities might need support from neighboring municipalities, several private sectors, county administrative board, national level, or even international support to handle disasters. Also vital is the ability of people to act and the fact that property owners has the primary responsibility for their own property. And since Sweden's platform was established in September 2007, the Swedish Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, we conducted a report about relevant legislation in Sweden to have a starting point to discuss within the national platform. And we saw that there is a strong legislation in place. We only have to use it, and most important is also that property owners and the public also know about the legislation. We, as many other countries, are integrating disaster risk reduction into the process of land use planning, development, civil protection, environment, climate adaptation within the scope of our legal frameworks. This far, legislation in Sweden has built on management by objectives and function-based broad legislation with an all-hazard approach, and there has not been any need for detailed specialized legislation for disaster risk reduction. But by implementing EU directives like the Floods Directive or the Water Frame Directive, we have also now rather detailed legislation in some areas. And we are used to have a bottom-up perspective, but lately it demands in some areas also a top-down perspective. Also, there is a strong political will and pressure from business community to reduce detailed regulation and legislation. In conclusion, it is important for us to continue to work within our multi-sector framework, internationally, nationally, and locally, with the support of appropriate legislation to reduce disaster risks. Key elements are strong governance and leadership in line with each country's risks, assumptions, political system, and priorities, and to involve people at risk. Sometimes it sounds as if only governments and authority are responsible. But at last, in Sweden, the largest responsibility lies at the owner of the property to protect her or his own property.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to, I think that this was pick out 2 points that really struck me. The one is that in some cases it's not that you have to have one particular law that binds everything together if the other ones are working just fine. In the end of the day, it's really about priorities. And sometimes the disaster management champions, even at the community level, need the support of binding law, and that law doesn't necessarily have to be at the local level. It may be at the national level, even if it's appointed at the local level. I think those are some interesting points. Very turn over for you.
Thank you. While we're waiting for the slide to get there, I'll just say that I'm not going to attempt to present the entire report on the Nepal study, which I conducted for the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in December last year. So I just want to pick out a few points. If you want to actually see the full report, that is available, as well as a small postcode summary with your papers. So my comments are based on the study, but really what I'm trying to talk about is what the law can do for disaster risk reduction, and just use examples from the Nepal study. As you're probably aware, Nepal is a country which is prone to many natural hazards, including monsoonal rains resulting in floods, forest fires, and it's also a very high earthquake risk area. So these are some of the issues that need to be considered. It's also increasingly urbanised. I think most people think about Nepal as a place of mountains, but it's actually a place of some very large cities. And many of the issues confronting Nepal in relation to disaster risk reduction relate to urban development. So when we think about what law can do for disaster risk reduction, I'm asking the question in that order because it seems to me that what we're talking about is a whole range of different types of laws that can contribute to an overall policy of disaster risk reduction in a particular country and region. In a given country, you can talk about what laws can do for disaster risk reduction at the macro level, and so national and regional or district laws can do things like prevent new risks with careful land use planning, environmental protection legislation and building codes. It can also establish in the constitutions or national bills of rights the right to safety and protection of residents of the country and their right to information. These can be the national overarching laws which can contribute to effective DRR at the community and local level. Then at the community and local level, laws can give a structure to community action on DRR, and one of the examples is establishing community-based organisations or registered non-government organisations, which can give continuity and longevity to particular initiatives. Because there are many effective programs and they receive project funding, and there's not always a follow-up. So that's one way of maintaining a legal structure which can continue a sustained community effort in disaster risk reduction. and also enable community action at the local level by removing barriers and providing things such as dispute resolution procedures where there's differences between communities about what should be done for mitigation, for example. One of the things that seems to me really important in disaster risk reduction for, especially for urbanised communities, is, but also for rural areas, is land use planning laws. Now, when you start talking about land use planning, it's not something that usually makes people sit up and take a great deal of interest. It sounds like a very boring subject, but actually the more I think about it, the more I think that land use planning is one of the keys to effective disaster risk reduction. It's an essential underpinning of a good legal framework for DRR in countries which are prone to natural hazards. What land use planning can do, as you see on this diagram, the green areas are the land that is and should be available for development in the gold standard of land use planning. So before you get to looking at actual approval for development, it's important to look at what land should not be available for development. So some land is inherently high risk if it's on a floodplain, if it's on an unstable hillside, then these are the sorts of land that should be reserved. There's also reservation of land for water catchments and for forests, which prevent further degradation further downstream, for example, and prevent flooding. So you have a system, you ideally have a system which is actually reserving the land before then approving other land for development. The development then needs to proceed in line with national building codes and local bylaws. In the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal, one of the issues they faced was that there was a lot of unregulated development, and there still is, where there was actually a lot of private land, but there was no legislative overlay to reserve land for roads and public infrastructure and public open space in the new developments. So there were still developments occurring which were not providing for these things, resulting in overly narrow streets with infrastructure crowding them further, which was creating an urban fire hazard because it wasn't allowing room for fire trucks to enter, and also an earthquake hazard because there was no public open space for evacuation. Now, one of the innovative approaches that was taken to this by the Ministry of Physical Planning and Works in Nepal was to establish a voluntary system of land pooling. So for new developments, they actually got the private landowners to agree to sacrifice a portion of their land, which would be given to public open space and roads and infrastructure, that would then be, that's then used to develop the urban development effectively, but also at the same time it increases the value of the existing private land because the development has all these facilities. And so that's been a response to a lack of a legislative foundation. That's been very innovative. But obviously it would be preferable for those legislative overlays to exist prior to the approval going ahead. So after the land use planning process, there's then the building and construction process, which also requires a very thorough cycle of legal foundation. So in Nepal, they have the difficulty that although they have actually a good National Building Act and they have regulations which cover most types of buildings, and they also have a National Building Code, implementation is the really big issue. So a local government, which is the implementing authority, some local governments didn't have a process established for a building plans approval process. Some had the approval process, but they didn't have an inspection process. And so what they're working towards at the moment is a full cycle where you have the building application process, the inspection, and therefore compliance with the building codes. An innovation that they also have developed in relation to owner-builder properties, because more than 90% of the buildings in Nepal are actually owner-built with no engineering or architect assistance from local materials. So they have developed and distributed some procedures called the mandatory rules of thumb for owner-builders to actually build earthquake-safe and fire safe buildings. So that's been one of their innovative responses to a situation where there was already a lot of construction happening that wasn't regulated. I think I'm almost out of time, so I won't go into a great deal of detail here, but this photograph is an area that was flooded last year where the land was actually swept away because the river course changed. And the communities on either side of it were stuck in a situation where they couldn't agree on flood mitigation measures, and so nothing was being done, and so they were going to be in the same situation the following year. That was seen to be a case where a legal procedure which provided for dispute resolution between those two communities would have greatly assisted in their disaster risk reduction. But on a more positive note, at community level, many communities are doing very effective disaster risk reduction programs and are then establishing local community-based organisations, which in the core are then able to access government funding and participate formally in the local and district government processes. And so that's a very effective way of sustaining those local community efforts and maintaining long-term accountability as well within the community for the expenditure of the community's resources in disaster risk reduction.
Thanks, Mary. It's very helpful. And I do recommend the report to those of you who haven't yet seen it. I think it gives particularly these maps about land use and building codes. I think are helpful to concentrating our minds. And also just to realize that there are interim steps, even as Nepal right now, as I understand, is working on new disaster, comprehensive national disaster risk reduction related legislation to replace a system that's fairly old and mostly response-based. These innovations in various areas have been fairly successful, like these mandatory rules have done, and this mostly voluntary process with land use pooling. With that, I am going to open up the floor. I hope we're coming close to the end of the sort of announcement period. Maybe those folks will bear with us for another 10, 15 minutes, if that's all right, if we have a discussion. Yes.
Thank you. David Overgaard from Norway. Thanks to the panel for very interesting presentations. I would just like to share with you some experiences from Norway in terms of legislation for disaster risk reduction, especially two quite recent laws that we are currently implementing. One is a new law on civil protection, which very clearly places the responsibility for disaster risk, for disaster preparedness and disaster management at the municipal level. According to this law, municipalities will have to carry out overall risk and vulnerability analysis and carry out exercises, etc., and develop preparedness plans to be prepared for any type of disaster or event that may strike that particular community. The other law is the Plan and Building Act, which is a very important instrument for the prevention side of disaster risk reduction, and as was highlighted here, especially when it comes to land use planning. At the launch of the Global Assessment Report today, it was said that land use planning is an instrument that gives the highest cost-benefit ratio. And we have an interesting instrument in our new Plan and Building Act called, I think it will translate into something that requires special consideration. It means that if the planner sees that there is a particular area where there is risk or potential risk for any particular reason, they can define that as a zone and add some regulations to it, saying that it's not allowed to build something here unless you make more thorough investigations of potential risk, or you have to do some adjustments to the building codes, etc. And I think the difference between these two laws is that the law on civil protection, it's well, we have quite many municipalities, and some of them are very small, covering huge geographical areas, but maybe only 500 citizens. So the possibility for local governments to actually do what they're supposed to do may be very limited in terms of, for example, carrying out annual exercises is a huge task for a small community. Whereas building disaster risk reduction based on the Plan and Building Act means basically that we are making use of instruments and regulations that the planners already know. So I think this is much more easier for local level planners to grasp, more easier for them to follow up. Well, just a few considerations about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm from a professional organization, Risk Management Solutions again. My question is to Ms. Olson. At the end of your presentation, you mentioned that your legislation somehow brings the responsibility down to the property owner. Could you throw some more light on that?
Yes, both in prevention and in acting when a disaster occurs. It's the owner that has to take care that they build on the proper land and that they build in such a way that they can stand also accidents and disasters. And also the owner has to have insurance to protect their property, and only if the owner themselves cannot handle the situation, then the municipal rescue board will help you. So it's a very strong responsibility on the owner. But of course, if the owner is one woman that can handle it, yes, then the rescue operators will help. But if it's a huge industry placed in the wrong place from the beginning, then they have to both fix their insurance, and they have to also take actions to prevent accidents and disasters from happening, and also they have to have their own rescue operators. And if disaster struck them anyway, then the society will.
I'll take up to just one or two more points since we're running low on time. Do anyone have any hands?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, maybe I'll be beside the point since I came late to this session, but when reading the title, I saw that the issue of liability would also be addressed here. Then I understand that, of course, at the community level, the liability of those in charge at the top may be invisible, but still, disasters have made little progress in the last 15 billion years, whereas unpreparedness seems to be progressing each year. So, do you think, does any one of you think that some way of liability, stronger liability, might wake up those who sleep until the day after the disaster comes?
I'm going to offer that to each of the members of the panel, but before, because I think it's a good wrapping up point. But are there any other questions that anyone has for the panel? Okay. Mette, would you like to comment very briefly?
Yes. Yes, it's very important that we use the legislation we have and also learn how to respond, and also it's very important that as here from Nepal that we have supervision to also look so that the laws will be fulfilled and that we work in accordance with the legislation at all levels, and that we learn from mistakes. And often that's the case in Sweden. New regulations comes after huge disasters. Then we correct our legislation a little bit and we carry on. But the supervision is also very important, and that we use all the knowledge we have from research side, from supervision and from new techniques in other countries when working at all levels. And one of the most important things for
Philippines on disaster risk reduction and management, there is a penal provision. There are prohibited acts that if a local official, a national official will violate them, there are corresponding penalties. But these are more of managing humanitarian assistance. So, for example, if a mayor or a certain local official misappropriates or let's say changes the name of the donor into his name, so those are things that are punishable under the new law. But of course, there are other laws that govern the infractions committed by government officials in the Philippines. So if there's a neglect of duty, inefficiency, corresponding penalties will also be applied, but not on the DRRM law, but in other laws pertaining to local national government officials.
But I think that the themes of liability is quite related to the community. Something that we have to do to risk reduction, to achieve the objective, is invest in the empowerment of the community. So community by itself can guarantee how to fulfill the objectives, the mission, and ask to the authorities for one way. And second, the community by itself is object and subject of the action. He has the obligation to be part of the solution, because they want to pay, but at the same time, they are the most vulnerable people located in the most vulnerable places, should be part of the team that work with the decision provided by the law. I think that we should not only think about investing in infrastructure, a big amount of money in infrastructure. We have to invest in the people, in the community. That's why when you look in the budget, we can divide what are we going to invest in the things, in the infrastructure, and what are we going to invest in the people, in the capacity of the people, in the empowerment of the people, in the training of the people.
Thank you. Mary.
In a sense, responsibility and liability are tied together, but they're also separate. And I was just going to make a comment from the perspective of governments and local governments as well. Clear responsibility for the safety of the people in the local area. That I think if the law can do that, that's a really important starting point. And in a sense, that's not a private law concept of liability, and it's not about compensation, but it is a form of political responsibility.